Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Jim Olson, Assistant Executive Director for the National Tile Contractors Association, and thank you for attending today's webinar titled Practical Advice for Dealing with the Impacts of Coronavirus on Construction. Join FMI Principal Mike Clancy as he dives into FMI's first quarter forecast and discusses the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and economic shutdown on the construction industry. With a mix of industry data and best practices from FMI's clients, you will be better equipped to handle this disruption to your business and to better be prepared to scale up your operation quickly after the quarantine. Today's webinar will be muted. Please use the questions area on your computer to type in your questions. We will answer as many questions at the end of this presentation as we can, and for those of you whose questions are not answered, I will be putting an email address for Michael on the chat screen, and you can send him your question. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer. All webinars are available to watch at any time on the NTCA YouTube channel shortly after the webinars are presented. Please go to the NTCA YouTube channel, subscribe, and you will be notified of all upcoming NTCA videos, including all technical webinars, giving you easier access to watch all current and past programs at your convenience. If the audio on your computer is poor, call the number on the invite to this webinar to listen on your phone. All right, here we go. As a principal with FMI, Mike Clancy works with all manner of engineering and construction companies with a focus on operational improvement and strategic thinking. With a strong background in construction operations and a depth of strategy consulting experience, Mike brings a unique viewpoint to corporate strategic discussions. Mike, we welcome you. I'm sure this is going to be a great program.
Thank you, Jim, and I appreciate the NTCA asking FMI to speak on this topic. I know it is certainly top of mind for us as it is for the rest of the industry. This is not going to be a doom and gloom conversation, but hopefully a conversation that you will find filled with practical tips to ensure that you're as set up for success as possible. A few caveats to our conversation today. First, FMI is not a bunch of epidemiologists, so this is not an update on COVID-19 diagnoses, on whether the curve is flattening sufficiently or not, or anything of that sort. We leave that up to the professionals at the CDC and at the various state departments of health. The second is we are not an expert on the CARES legislation or other current legislation or human resources law. Many industry attorneys and other support companies, CPA firms, et cetera, have done their own very well by a lot of those folks. And so not ground we need to plow over in this conversation today. The third thing is just because.
Hey, Mike, you seem to be coming in and out. We've lost you. Can you hear me, Mike? Please stand by for a minute. I'll see if I can reconnect with Mike.
Hello.
Are you back, Mike?
I am back. I apologize for that, folks. Hopefully you can hear me now. I've dialed in. I'm not on the computer audio, but these are the joys of the joys of working across distance. particularly for folks like me that live out in the country. So Jim, you can hear me. You guys can hear me again just fine?
Yes, you're very clear now, Mike. And maybe you could just start over, please.
Sure. Apologies for that. So again, as I said, wanted to start this off with a few caveats. The first is we're not going to talk about the epidemiology of the disease, where we see it headed, whether the curve is flattening. We think there are great resources at the State Department of Health level, the departments of health of various large cities, and the CDC. So we're going to leave that to them. The second is we are not going to spend a bunch of time talking about the impacts of the various legislations in human resources law. We will touch on them briefly, but if you're looking for resources on those, many construction industry attorneys have done great webinars on those sorts of things, and all that is widely available out there right now. And you know, the advice that we give and the things that we talk about, you're going to want to revisit decisions you make very frequently. And so to give you an idea of what that looks like for our organization, our management team is meeting 3 times a week via teleconference to assess decisions, assess what we're hearing, and make any needed tweaks or adjustments. That's the kind of fast-paced environment we're in. It requires that level of involvement. What you're going to be permitted to do is going to be very variable based on where in the country you are. And so I've got clients in parts of the U.S. where everything is completely shut down. Folks in New York City, for example, or in Pennsylvania, where they've seen half or more of their work deemed non-essential and dry completely up. And I've got other clients that are largely operating under business as usual with perhaps some additional safety and isolation requirements. And so your local jurisdiction is going to be what dictates what you must do. And the last thing here is, you know, sort of an obvious caveat. Anytime we give any forecasting or advice, you know, we're doing it with the best available information at this time. We don't have a crystal ball, but what we do have is, you know, over 65 years of experience serving the construction industry. That said, this is the first time that we've, in the history of FMI, that we've experienced a situation exactly like this. Although we've looked to past recessions, the Great Recession of 2008, the post 9/11 disruption in the economy, we've looked to those for some of our advice as well. So those are some caveats before we get going, and I'll jump right in with, you know, our forecast of construction put in place. And this is our first quarter 2020 forecast. It's based on getting final actuals for 2019 and then forecasting 2020. And what we've got here is 3 different views of what the world will look like coming out of this pandemic. And so we are operating under that top line view, which is the current assumed trajectory, which says we're going to have a 2-quarter recession, 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, and end the year about flat compared to 2019. This would be an official recession, recession being defined as 2 or more quarters of negative economic growth. But this would be sort of the mild case, or the current assumed case we're looking at. But there are some other things we have to think about as well, right? The second one being an extended economic disruption. So if you look at the orange line on your screen there, you'll see 3 quarters of negative GDP growth, and we would not see economic recovery until after the presidential election. And that would take us quite a bit of time to return back to, we would not plan to return back to 2019 numbers on building construction over the next 5 years. So that's a pretty significant impact. The final one is what we've called disruption to disintegration, which would be 6 or more quarters of negative GDP growth. So we would, in this case, we would see declines through the second half or through the first half of 2021. Think of this as equivalent to the Great Recession of 2008, 2009 in terms of its severity, length, and impact. And then, of course, if you think of that Great Recession of 2008, 2009, it took the industry about 13 years to recover its construction volume from pre-recession numbers. So we look at all three of these as potential. You know, our current assumption is that first line, that current assumed trajectory, that we would expect to see recovery in 2020, and we would be back at last year's numbers sometime in the next 24 months or so. The next one of these is on non-building structures construction. So this is things like bridges, rail, water treatment, infrastructure for the most part. And so what we expect here is, you know, under the current assumed trajectory, a lot of spending on infrastructure, which is fairly typical in recessionary times. Government tends to spend money on infrastructure projects at that time. If you look at the extended economic disruption line, I mean, it crosses the 2019 line very quickly. Really, the only time that we see significant impact to that non-building structures market is in that disruption to disintegration, where we would have a recession of similar size and severity as the Great Recession. The AGC, the Association of General Contractors, has been doing what they call industry snapshots, so surveys of their membership, and this is from a couple of weeks back, where almost 40% of the 1,600 respondents said they had been directed to stop work on one or more projects. So this is a fairly significant impact that we're seeing sort of nationwide. 45% of respondents reported experiencing project delays or disruptions. One of the big issues that we're seeing right now is shortages of materials, parts, and equipment. So not just construction material, but also PPE for workers, such as respirators. I was having a conversation with one of my clients last week. They donated their entire stock of N95 masks to their hospital client. 3 days later, their hospital client said, hey, unless you guys are wearing N95 masks, they're not going to be able to work in the hospital. And so sort of a catch-22. They did the right thing. They gave the masks to the frontline medical workers, and then they were told, well, that means now you can't actually work in here until you get more of those. So that's going to be an impact. Close to 20% reporting shortages of craft workers. We expect this to increase as more people are affected and are self-quarantining. 16% said projects were delayed by shortages of government workers for inspections, permits, and other actions. Very early in this epidemic, or pandemic rather, one of my clients called me to tell me that one of the municipalities he was in had stopped all inspections. This was before any significant shutdowns had occurred in most parts of the country. And so, you know, that sort of thing will, I think, also continue to increase. And the last number there, 13% of those surveyed reported delay or disruption occurred because a potentially infected person had visited a job site. There's a lot of due diligence and follow-up that's required when you've got someone on the job that is potentially infected. A lot of cleaning and things like that that's going to introduce delays. And so we want to just talk about countermeasures. And so I think there's four kind of key areas that we want to focus on here. The first is the health and well-being of our people, right? That's got to be your primary concern as a business owner, as a business leader, is the health and well-being of your people. And so having good internal communications, so a plan for how you're going to communicate to your folks, what that frequency is going to be, what the approach is. We've gone to, as I said, multiple management team meetings a week via webinar, as well as at least weekly interaction with all of our people. And so something similar to that. Best practices around hygiene on the job site. So we're seeing a lot of good things there that we'll share. Some sort of protocol for remote working. Staggered scheduling to make sure we don't have as many people on the job site as we might once have had at the same time. A way for people to share concerns and get those concerns heard to address mental well-being. And then any possible at-home assistance for families directly impacted with a loved one who has who's been tested positive for coronavirus. So that's sort of the first set of countermeasures. The next is, once we've got our people covered, we want to think about our clients' people and our projects, right? And so, the first thing is to have a clear understanding of force majeure rules in your contract and what that does and does not protect, how that does and does not protect you. Really being proactive in your conversations with your owners to address potential impacts. Regular and consistent communications with your client to make sure that they know what you're doing to protect their people and to protect their project. Assessment of your vendor and supply chain impacts, particularly for any supply chain you've got coming in from overseas. Project staffing plans to deal with having enough labor to get things done. And then, of course, having a standardized personal protective equipment and project hygiene protocol for your jobs. Those kind of things can put your client and project well-being center of mind. The next couple here are just thinking about your market sector and your corporate strategic imperatives. So, the market sector one is one that is going to be an interesting conversation. What's the client and market sector impacts of this pandemic likely to be, right? Is it going to lead to more telecommuting in general and then less office construction, for example? Are there going to be long-term supply chain considerations if we're sourcing things from Asia and the Pacific Rim? Are there going to be different markets that we can look at getting into? All of those things are things that we've got to be thinking about. Maybe not something we can take action on immediately, but starting to build a plan around. Also plans to manage our customer relationships. So making sure that we're staying on top of that. And then, just this whole sector of tenant improvement and remodel, with a move away from porous surfaces and a move towards more easily cleaned and more epidemiologically resistant surfaces, we think is one of those areas, particularly for NTCA members, where there's going to be opportunity in the future. The last one here around corporate strategic initiatives is all about protecting the viability of the business long term, right? So the first is scenario planning. So thinking back to those 3 possible scenarios we laid out, what would we do if we experienced that worst case scenario? What does our business viability planning look like for that? Let's storyboard our cash flows. Let's figure out where money's coming into and going out of the business, and how we can maximize the one and minimize the other. Let's make sure that we've got our internal risk management in the best possible condition, that we've got triggers or some other marker that we say, if we see this particular trend heading in this direction, we're going to make these types of executive decisions. And the last piece there is this whole talent management and personnel decision tree. None of us want to make those hard talent and people decisions, but sometimes that is indicated by what's going on in the market. So we'll roll into what we're seeing really be effective in each of these areas. And so, we'll just kind of start with common practices. And we would say that one, work from home is sort of the new normal, particularly for your project management, estimating, business development type folks. We're mainly seeing skeleton crews of only 2 to 3 people in the office when necessary, if at all. A lot of our clients have gone to teleworking for all of their non-field employees. You've got to make sure that you've got consistent policies across all offices. This can be especially challenging when you work in multiple geographies where the state and local governments are taking this with a different level of seriousness or a different level of restriction, but it will still allow for more consistency in how you apply things, more consistency in how you treat people. Varying schedules to limit exposure to one another. So different people in the office on different days, or different working hours, things like that, to minimize the number of people that are exposed to each other. Extra cleaning of offices. So there is certainly an epidemiological benefit to extra cleaning of surfaces that employees come into contact with. But there's also a big peace of mind impact as well. And so anything we can do to drive that is certainly going to be appreciated by our people. No unscheduled visitors, no solicitation signs placed on all doors. This is really about keeping your people as safe from exposure to the public as possible.
Mike, this is Jim. Real quickly,
Yeah.
when we lost you, we also lost you as a presenter, so we're not seeing any slides change since the countermeasures checklist.
Okay, I don't know how that happened. Let me see here.
So I need you to come back to rejoin. I'm sorry for all you attendees. If you can bear with us a little bit, there's a lot of people doing webinars and stuff right now. So Mike, if you can go back in and re-attend.
I'm working on it, right, Jim?
Thank you.
See here.
Mike, I'm making you a presenter right now. So if you can go into that screen and show your, reshare your screen, please.
All right. I'm working on it. Let's see. Let me see. I gotta do something. Oh no.
Mute your computer. Here, I'll mute you.
All right. Can you hear me now? Hello.
We can hear you.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yep. If you can go to full screen mode.
Okay. Let's see. I don't know why it's. Hang on. Sorry, all. This is not what we were looking for.
Oh, I thought this was part of the presentation, Mike.
What about now? Do we have my screen up now?
Could I ask for an attendee to tell me if you have a screen up on the chat screen? Are you seeing just one slide, common practices for job site and office? Avia, can you respond? Okay, we see your note slide.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Let's try this again. How about now? Do you still see the note slide, or? Here we go. What about that?
Now we just see your Microsoft screen.
Oh, for the love of Pete. Okay, let's try this one more time. What do we see?
We see all your notes.
All right, how about now?
All right, we're ready. We got your first slide. If you can move forward now
Okay.
to.
Well, we kind of, I talked through the common practices, particularly around the whole minimizing folks in the office. So let's move on to the job site. And this is an area where I think we see some significant challenges. We've had some clients have some particular issues around the cultural implications of us versus them between the field and office. And this very often comes when the field employee or their spouse calls in and says, hey, everybody else is working from home, but I or my spouse have to endanger themselves going onto the job site and working. And that's certainly a valid concern. And so, the first place we start there is by having a lot of communication, right? Weekly or even twice a week, superintendent and foreman town halls, and keeping the reminder and the focus that the field and putting work in place is the economic lifeblood of the company. That the work and commitment of folks in the field is critical to keeping the doors open. One thing we're seeing some clients do is hire nursing services to be at the job site, do temperature checking every worker, and doing standard questions around exposure. We're also seeing more people move to multiple smaller shifts to allow for greater social distancing on the job site. One of my clients is delivering lunch to the job site every day so that people don't have to leave and go off site and potentially expose themselves to other folks. Some of my clients are sending their higher risk employees home, those who have a history of respiratory illness or are of advanced age. They're just taking them out, sort of off the line completely. The last one seems a little counterintuitive in a time when we're isolating, but really your presence as the CEO or the owner of the company out on the job site to go let everybody know that you respect and appreciate what they're doing, and to keep them up to date with what you're doing to protect them and their health and to protect the overall health of the company. All of that is really important, and it's one of those key leadership behaviors that we're seeing right now that really can have an impact. For many of you, your field office and the way the field and the job sites are running is going to be largely driven by the owner or the general contractor setting their own standards. And so obviously you'll look to them first, but in the event those standards don't exist or are inconsistent with what you're trying to do, some people were seeing limiting meetings and briefings to 10 people or fewer. Again, advising particularly field office employees, so folks who may be in the field, but they are project managing in the field or something like that, when and where possible, working from home. One thing that we're seeing is even using video conferences for meetings when everybody's in the same building, just to avoid face-to-face interaction and the possibility to spread the disease. Obviously, you've got to hope that it works a little bit better than my webinar has worked so far, but really keeping that focus on keeping space and distance between people. Should go without saying, but any employee who is sick should be sent home. There are rules right now about how those employees need to be treated from a financial and benefits standpoint. And those are all kind of laid out in the legislation that passed recently. And so I'd advise you and encourage you to look at some of the resources that are out there on that. But you don't want to take a chance on exposing anybody, whether or not they've tested positive. If they're showing symptoms, if they're sick, they should be sent home. Many people are saying, hey, look, if you've got allergies and you're sneezing, stay home. We know it's not COVID, but you're freaking out your coworkers, and so for that reason, we want you to stay home. So, I mean, you've got to understand that one of the big challenges of this is not just the virus itself, but also just sort of the fear and concern around the overall pandemic. This idea of staggering breaks and lunches, we just want to avoid people congregating and gathering together. We want to really stay focused on keeping our distance between people. So there is some inconsistency in understanding how employee leave is going to be handled under these new laws, who can claim it, what's required before returning, et cetera. So a best practice is to ensure that you've got a uniform process that you're following, so that all decisions and documentation funnel up through the same channels to ensure consistency. In other words, don't let folks on projects make their own rules for who has to go home and how they're going to be covered when they're home. That needs to be a corporate level decision, and it should be made in consultation with either your legal team or other advisors who have sort of that insight on the regulations. Keep in mind that because this is an illness, HIPAA privacy regulations come into play. And so while you can say, you are an employee who has interacted with somebody who has symptoms consistent with coronavirus, you cannot say, Jenny Smith has coronavirus and I know she sits 2 seats down from you, so you need to self-isolate, right? So we've got to let our employees know if they've been exposed without exposing our other employees' private health information. And again, contact human resources and legal experts for clarity. FMI is not a human resources or law firm, so it's not our space. Limit and stop cross-pollination among crews. So one of the things that's really interesting is to the extent you can keep the same crew working together, that's going to minimize the number of potential infection vectors that they have, right? It's only going to be those same folks they work with. A lot of times, as we start to slow down, as projects start getting canceled, we want to try and keep all of our best people working, and so we'll reshuffle the decks on our crews. In this particular situation, that's a very bad move. We want to try and keep our crews as consistent as possible, so that if we do have anybody test positive or become symptomatic, we know exactly who they've been exposed to. One of the things we've seen is around remote employees, right? So there are a lot of folks who have employees that are working remotely and staying in hotel rooms, and usually we're doubling people up in those rooms. There's been a push to lock down longer term bookings so that people are not leaving that room and then coming back to that room 3 days later after who knows how many folks have checked in and what their disease condition is, and also eliminating room sharing to mitigate those challenges as well. Some companies have struggled with making sure that we've got sufficient cleaning materials on the job site. So what we're seeing work is maybe reaching out to restaurant suppliers, getting things like soap, sanitizer, that sort of thing from restaurant suppliers. Since they're not selling to restaurants as much right now, there's some opportunity there. I have a client who made a lot of their own hand sanitizer. They bought a bunch of Everclear and some other things and made hand sanitizer. I do not have his recipe, but he put water coolers full of hand sanitizers out on the job site to make sure that his folks were able to appropriately protect themselves.
Mike, you went
yeah.
offline again. We're not getting a change of slides. You're offline again.
Okay. Let me try this again. Let's see.
All right. You might be, it looks like you came back online. See if you can change your slide. We're on common practices for job site and office.
Okay. Do you see one that, okay, let's see. Construction site shutdown checklist.
No.
All right.
There we go. All right. We're back.
Okay. All right. Well, look, we were moving on to this one anyway. So, and appreciate you guys, your patience with the internet here. It is almost certainly me, because I live way out in the country and everyone's on bandwidth right now. So, construction site shutdown checklist. So, one of the things that a lot of us are being faced with is the need to wind down our projects. And in many cases, we're being told with very short notice to shut down jobs. And so, the first item there is around site security. So making sure that we've got measures in place to secure the site, to secure our material and equipment, locked up in Connex boxes or however we're doing that, that we're protecting against water intrusion, that we've got the right sort of prevention methodologies in place. The key thing there, though, is to get with your insurance provider. And so a lot of times you'll have to run additional insurance policies on the job while it's shut down, particularly to protect your installed work and your material that's not yet installed. That's a critical element that a lot of folks are not giving enough attention to. So if you're being told to stop work, you need to have you need to go ahead and shut your site down in a structured, consistent way and document the time and the money that costs to do that. All of that is recoverable on the back end of this, but you will need to document what you've done to shut the site down properly, and how much that took and what that cost you to do. But then we're going to come out of the back end of this, and we're going to have to restart a bunch of projects. And so FMI's view is that's going to pose significant challenges to our industry. We're going to see logistical challenges like we've never seen before in terms of all of our projects wanting to restart all at once. And so we really need to be thoughtful about how we do that. It's almost like we're going to start these jobs up again from the beginning. So really have a detailed checklist and sort of a pre-construction plan for how we're going to restart those projects. And then we're going to need to plan for and quantify the cost and schedule implication of all these changes in how we're going to do business, right? We're going to have new hygiene protocols coming out of this. There's going to be some material that's going to have to be impacted that is on the critical path that's going to have to be rush shipped. We're going to have all kinds of additional general conditions costs. There's going to be all kinds of acceleration costs, and our labor productivity isn't going to be there. And so all of those things you need to document and keep track of, because again, all of these are recoverable. This is not, these are not things that you are or can be expected to have covered in your initial bid on the project. So we'll shift a little bit off of the project and onto the business. And so we'll talk a little bit about financial management. And the first step there is, maintain financial resiliency. So this is allowing yourself the flexibility to act and to make the kind of decisions you need to make for your business. There are some no-brainer items, right? So, we're probably going to delay wage reviews. We're probably going to delay any capital expenditures. We're going to delay any non-essential spending, right? We also want to make some assessments of what the potential budget impacts are, and stress test our balance sheet based on best case, worst case, and sort of expected case scenarios, right? So what do we think what do we think is realistic for us to do through the end of 2020 and 2021? What if it's, a lot better than that? What if it's a lot worse than that? And what are the decisions that we would make about our overhead? What are the decisions we would make about other kind of cost-cutting efforts? Selling off equipment and other assets, layoffs, furloughs, salary reductions, etc. What you want to be doing is yes. Yes.
Mike, I just want to tell everybody, Mike is not online again and he's offline. So you're doing a good job of explaining all this. If everybody can just listen carefully, and hopefully he comes back and can catch up with his PowerPoint. So please listen, and there's lots of information coming. Keep going, Mike. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. I do not. Okay. All right. So again, thinking about, you want to game plan all of these cost reduction measures ahead of time. You don't want to be doing them reactively. That's when you really can kind of run into some trouble. That's when it becomes very easy to defer the hard decisions. And so when you defer the hard decisions, all that does is create a much harder decision later. And so it's important to game plan it. It's important to set triggers for when you're going to make those changes, when you're going to make those cuts, and to be keeping an eye on those triggers. A lot of my clients are accessing their line of credit, and when possible, when it's not prevented by covenants, they're actually taking that cash and moving it to another bank so that the bank can't just claw it back. This would be sort of a hedge to a potentially long, protracted downturn. Likewise, I've got clients who, took advantage of the CARES Act, paycheck protection loans in a similar manner to improve cash flow in the short term as a hedge against this long, protracted downturn. Document all financial impacts. Since we don't have a lot of clarity today about what tax credits and contract rights are going to be applied, you definitely want to account for everything now to support any claims later. There's no way you're going to be able to collect if you don't have good documentation. So document all financial and schedule impacts as you go. The next piece is around managing your cash flow. So really being on top of that means having weekly line-by-line accounts receivable discussions with all of your project managers. So we want to have answers and action plans for delayed payments. We want to do the same thing for unapproved change orders where we've already kind of spent money or we've committed to cost. We want to have a game plan for how we're going to get those converted and collected. It's really all about keeping the focus on cash and collection. You want your project management team really focused on that invoicing, not necessarily accounting, because your project manager is the one that's going to be the most likely to be able to give you the real answers about what's hanging up payment and why. They ought to be getting an authorized approval before sending the invoice. So I'm going to invoice for this much work done based on our conversation. Is that okay with you? Yes. Okay. And then invoice it. And then, follow up even before the invoice or even before the bill is due, right? Follow up as we're getting close to the time when you should be paid, just to ensure that it's going to be processed. And then really focus on quickly escalating any slow pays. In the last recession, I had a client tell me that they looked at their clients and said, everyone is probably sitting around a boardroom table at some point talking about who they cannot pay this month. And we just don't want to be the one that they think they cannot pay, right? So it's not about being difficult. It's not about being pushy. It's not about being unprofessional. It's about consistency with the contract and the payment and the payment methodology.
Mike,
yes.
Tell me what slide you're on. I'm gonna switch presenters and make myself a presenter. I have it at least in a way we can show them what you're talking about. What slide are you on?
Slide 15. So I'll keep talking here while Jim brings that up. One of the other things that okay. So we talked about invoicing.
Tell me when you're switching.
Will do, Jim. So we talked about invoicing. The next piece there is about cash flow projections on projects. And I will tell you that not a lot of firms do this consistently, but to the extent possible, particularly in a time like now when cash is of critical importance, we really want to figure out where the cash is coming and going on our projects as much as possible. And so having that clarity, having each of your project managers develop that in conjunction with your CFO or controller, we just really want a good overall view of where's money coming into the business and where's money going out of the business. Our perspective is that project restarts are going to create the most pain, right? So our clients are going to say go, but payment will remain slow. 45 days will have strung out to 60 or 90 days. And so there's a real danger that you as trades have that you'll get out over your skis trying to generate revenue, and you'll burn off the cash cushion that you have, and some firms will be badly exposed. And so that's the real area of concern and where you need to stay focused. It's our long-held view that more firms go bust in expansionary times than in recessionary times. And so coming out of this, we feel like there's going to be a lot of firms that are going to be at risk. And so just stay on top of that. Next slide, Jim. So strategic considerations, we want to be thinking about the needs, not for the market as it was, but for what we expect it to be over the next few years. And so this comes from our forecast, but it also comes from your conversations with your clients, from understanding what their spends are going to be like, from what markets they're going to be playing in. Some markets we expect to see higher growth. Some we expect to see lower growth. So the people that you needed or the people that you had before this hit may not be the same that you need over the next few years to address the market. That may be true of your sales and estimating folks. That may be true of your project teams. So you need to maintain that constant dialogue with your key business partners. This isn't just your customers. This is also your bonding and surety and banking, right? So thinking about what the surety needs will be and what key financial ratios you're going to have to manage. That's an important management effort that you have to undertake, as well as banking covenant issues, many of which are going to be based on your cash situation. Next slide. So, as we're thinking about sort of the whole strategic considerations of the business, one thing that is very true is there will be some companies that will have sheltered some growth capital through this time that are going to be able to take on some growth opportunities, right? Some acquisitions. They're going to be able to go out in the talent market and hire key people. They're going to be able to expand geographically or into new segments. They're going to be able to self-perform more. And so to the extent that you have the capability to shelter some of your capital, we would encourage you to do so. One thing that we saw in the Great Recession was a lot of our clients, because they didn't make the hard decisions quickly to rationalize their business to their new market, they burned up a lot of their capital retaining people that just weren't going to be core any longer, or retaining parts of their business that weren't going to be core any longer. And so when the market finally started to turn, they didn't have the capital to go out and do anything new, different, or expansionary. They were really kind of stuck. And so, we would argue that you're better served by making the hard decisions now, and not hoarding, but sort of preserving as much capital as you can to create yourself some flexibility, both for the short and long-term considerations. The other thing is looking at your strategy, right? So I've got some clients who have already reached out and said, Mike, the stuff that we were focused on isn't going to be there anymore. We've got to have a conversation to think about what different opportunities we need to pursue. And so this requires some leadership in attention and some leadership thinking. So you got to take a break from the emergencies of today and think about what the business is going to be long term. And then just maintaining discipline in how you allocate that strategic capital that you've reserved. Next slide. So, sort of the last thing I want to touch on here is this whole idea of leadership in this crisis. So, if you're on this call, if you're an owner, if you're a leader in your company, your employees are looking to you to provide calm, a sense of control, some comfort that we're thinking about this and we're focused on it and we're being thoughtful in the way we make decisions. This 24-hour news cycle and all the sort of panic that we're seeing out there is almost certainly having an impact on your employees. So if they see that you are thoughtful, deliberate, and consistent in your decision making, it will create in them more confidence that you know what you're doing for them and for the company. Establish some sort of task force of senior executives to meet regularly, to review policies, to identify things that need to be communicated to the organization and how we're going to go about doing that. You've got to be clear and consistent in your communication, and you've got to maintain visibility. If you can't physically see all of your people, at least reach out to them in a 5 or 10 minute phone call once a week or every other week, just to check in, see how they're doing, that sort of stuff. It's important to model social distancing, but also to be visible and be involved in your employees' lives so that they know that you're working on their behalf. And it's important wherever possible to show employees that the business is ongoing and that you're focused on the opportunities that are available. So, for example, if you end up having to make a G&A decision and lay off or furlough some workers, make a reduction in force, it's important to explain to the employees the rationale behind why we did that, and without, while being very careful not to denigrate the people that are no longer with you, to point out that we've sized the business for the type of market and the size market we think we're going to have coming out of this, and we've retained the people that we think give us the best chance to win in that market. And so, creating some clarity around that. That's another reason to make those decisions in a very structured and proactive way rather than kind of death by 1,000 cuts, because it does create more confidence in those that remain, that we've tackled it, we're done with it, and we have a plan to go forward and win. And next slide. Well, and that concludes my thoughts, or FMI's thoughts on practical advice for dealing with the impacts of coronavirus on construction. Jim, I don't know if we had any questions come through on the chat that we want to take a minute or two to respond to.
So first of all, Mike, I want to thank you for being a trooper and, getting through this. It was a little confusing for everyone, and we got your slides up and I was moving them for you, and that worked out great. My first question to you though is, will the attendees be able to send you an email and get a copy of this presentation?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, because we kind of went off a little while there. So what I'm saying is, on your screen, you see Mike Clancy, you see his phone number, you see his email address. Jot that down while we're talking, while we're answering this next question, because you can send him an email and ask for a copy of the presentation or ask any questions. So perfect. So I do have a question, at least at this time, and it was about the HIPAA. And one of our members was saying it binds them too, and he thought it only applied to the medical office where they received the diagnosis. Can you kind of clarify that?
Yeah, so I have gotten mixed messages on that. So one of the this is where it comes into that whole checking with HR lawyers part of it, because one of the things we've heard is that HIPAA binds the medical practitioner. But if, for example, that individual went and was tested at your direction or was sent home at your direction, does that have an impact? My view is it is safer just to reach out to the individuals that may have been exposed, rather than to say, hey, everybody that hung out with John Smith over the last 2 weeks, John's tested positive for COVID. Now, if the employee allows you to share the information, then it's a non-issue, right? You reach out to the employee and you say, hey, if you don't mind, I would like to share with our team that you have tested positive or you're showing symptoms consistent with, so that they can get themselves checked out or they can keep an eye on it. Then it's a non-issue. But I would not. I would be really careful before I share that information otherwise. And like I said, we're not labor law attorneys, but that's kind of the last thing you want to get in a situation with as well.
All right. Here's another question. Are you hearing anything about GCs being approved for PPP loans or EIDL loans? And if they are, will that help kickstart the projects once this is moving forward?
So I have several general contractor clients who have already received their distribution on some of these loan products. So I don't know whether or not it will have an impact on kickstarting the projects, though, because ultimately that's going to be owner and municipality driven. So, for example, if you're in Pennsylvania, where the governor has ruled that construction is not an essential activity unless it's in a few certain categories, you can't really do anything until that gets changed or revised. But yeah, GCs are getting the same access to that capital that the trade contractors are. What it's mainly doing right now is buying everybody time to get through this period of uncertainty.
Well, that is all the questions we have now, Mike. Attendees, thank you for staying with us. Sorry it was a little clunky, and we're going to put this on our YouTube channel, probably not till Monday, but we'll have it up there, and you can go through it again, and you can either email Mike or call him about getting this presentation, or I do have the presentation too, and I would have no problem sending it to anyone if you want to send an email to me. For those of you that know me, it's jim@tile-assn.com. Let's see here. So
yeah, I've already gotten a few emails. Yeah, I've already gotten a few emails. I'm happy to share that with anyone. Again, apologies for the technical issues. This is what I think this is showing more than anything is how important good broadband is, and particularly if you live out in the sticks like I do, what an impact that can have. So thank you all for your patience.
No matter what, Mike, it was great information. I think it helped a lot of people and gave them some good direction. So thanks, everybody. Look forward to our next invite for our following webinar that will come up in May and beginning of May. So thanks, everyone. Be safe. We appreciate you being here. Bye-bye.